Let's now take a look at some best practices when it comes to web writing. The main thing when you start a web copy is to think about the structure. You need to make sure that whichever structure you decide to follow suits your needs. So if you are covering, say, a breaking news event, such as a fatal car accident, you might want to go with the inverted pyramid. You will start with important facts, you will give some context, and then you will add more details. But, if a reader were to stop reading after a few sentences, that reader would still have enough information to understand the story. On the right, we have another example of another structure. This one is the hourglass. So you can start with some facts, go into the context and whatnot, and generally there will be kind of a pivot point, which will bring you to another angle, and then you will conclude your story. That's a structure that is akin sometimes to a TV piece in which, the reporter will open up the piece with a testimony from someone. The reporter will delve into the story, and then at the very end, we will see once more our original hero. There are a variety of story structures out there. The key message here is that you should make sure to choose the most appropriate structure based on the story you're working with. Headlines are also very important, as we saw in the mandatory readings, so I won't go over each and every line of the mandatory readings, but I want to show you a few good examples of headlines. The first one is from the Edmonton Journal: Flat Earthers from around the globe coming to Edmonton for international conference. There is kind of a pun there. It's kind of ironic that they're flying from around the world to attend a flat earth conference. You need to be careful when trying to be funny or clever with a headline. Remember that the most important thing is for your headline to be accurate and easy to understand, but I would argue that this headline nails it. It works. We have another one from NPR: Nothing lasts, Forever 21 discovers as another clothing chain files for bankruptcy. Again, quite clever, yet it is very factual, so we know right away what the story is all about. Because remember that online, people will often see your headline, maybe a photo, and that's all you've got to drag them into your story. If they're using Google News or Apple News, they will see the headline and maybe the photo. If they're simply Googling a few keywords, they will likely only see your headline. So your headline still needs to tell the story. First U.S. Space Force deployment to land not so far away, Qatar. That's from the BBC. It is a nod to the Star Wars universe. It's an article about the fact that the first U.S. Space Force troops were deployed to the Middle East, not to space. The other headline is perhaps one that we need to be cautious with. Katy Perry kissed a boy on American Idol, and he didn't like it, based on the famous song, I Kissed a Girl and I Liked It. You have to be careful here because it is punny, but, some would argue that kissing someone without consent, like she did, is, I'm not saying that she was guilty of sexual assault, but could be akin to that, so you need to be careful when trying to be funny or clever with a headline in such a situation. And the last one is pretty interesting. Philly's Four Seasons Total Landscaping dishes the dirt on the news conference heard round the world. It was nothing we anticipated. You might remember during the last U.S. presidential election, there was this news conference at Four Seasons Total Landscaping in Philadelphia, and this newspaper article explains how the news conference ended up there, and we see another pun: Four Seasons Total Landscaping dishes the dirt, because they deal with dirt and soil. As in a previous video, you can actually click on all of those headlines if you want to read the full article. So simply download the PowerPoint slides, the slide deck, and you will be able to visit the original news articles if you wish to do so. Headlines are the secret weapons of writers and editors. More than any other element, a strong headline can grab the attention of readers and lure them into the story. That's from the Canadian Press Style Book. Thought it was a pretty interesting quote, so keep it in mind. Leads are also another way to grab your reader's attention. I have a few examples here for you. Two in French, two in English, and I will explain them. The first one, le maire de Castleman, Conrad Lamadeleine, est toujours en crise et est un petit moineau enragé. Peut-on lire dans des micro-billets publiés sur les médias sociaux par l'Ombudsman de l'Ontario. If you speak French, you might understand that crise tends to be seen as a swear word, and petit moineau enragé, that's not nice to say about an elected official. That being said, we still ran with this lead because it directly quotes tweets that were published by the Ombudsman of Ontario back in the day. Therefore, we felt that it was appropriate, although at perhaps at the limit of what is acceptable in good taste, we decided to run with it. The next one is a kind of two-step lead. When a magnitude 7 earthquake hit Haiti on January 12, 2010, Fanoun Mallette was pregnant with her son and working in a local hospital. On Sunday, exactly 10 years to the day of the disaster, Mallette and her family took part in a religious service at Église Évangéliste Baptiste d'Ottawa, a church on King Edward Avenue attended by members of the Haitian community. So we see here that in two short paragraphs, I was the author of this lead. I brought you from Haiti in 2010 to Ottawa in 2020. Another example, with one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind, U.S. Space Force troops have now boldly gone where many American soldiers have gone before. That's from the same story as before, the BBC, and in the headline, there was a pun from Star Wars, Far, Far Away. Here we see that there is a reference to Neil Armstrong, and there is also a reference to the opening monologue in Star Trek, going boldly where no one has gone before, in this case where many American soldiers have gone before. It works, and it's quite clear that, it's a story about American troops going somewhere on Earth, quite likely. And the last one, that's actually a story, a lead from a story written by a former student at the University of Ottawa, Yasmine Midi, and she went to Mali, and this is a lead which describes a scene from a helicopter. So, vue des airs, la ville de Gao semble paisible. À 762 mètres au-dessus du niveau de la mer, à bord d'un hélicoptère, un H-90, on ne voit ni les engins explosifs improvisés, ni l'ennemi qui attend de frapper, seulement l'insondable désert et la poignée de pêcheurs au bord du fleuve Niger. In English, we could loosely translate this lead as follows. Seen from the sky, the city of Gao looks quite peaceful. 762 meters above sea level, on board of an NH-90 chopper, we cannot see improvised explosive devices or the enemy lurking in the desert. We can only see the desert and a few fishermen near the Niger River. So it is a scene setter, and it works. And this lead is from a story written by a former student at the University of Ottawa, Yasmine Midi. She went to Mali to report on the peacekeeping efforts in the country. The first function of a lead is to inform, to answer the basic question that underlies any news story. What happened? That answer sets the pattern for the rest of the story. The lead also has a second function, to engage the audience, inviting people to read on. It's a quote from the Canadian Reporter, News Writing and Reporting. Great book. The chapter, A Day in the Life of Three Newsrooms, is actually from that book, and I do encourage you to borrow it from the library or someone and to read it. It is a very insightful textbook. Quotes are what allows us to add color to a story. But you need to make sure that you follow some rules when handling a quote. You can fix typos, minor grammatical mistakes, and so on, but make sure that you quote people verbatim. You can translate quotes into English. So if you interview someone in French or Spanish, please do translate quotes into English. If you are unsure, though, if, say, you interview someone and you are unsure about what they said exactly because you weren't recording the interview or you had an issue with your recorder, it's best to paraphrase. Quote people verbatim, mentioned that before. If you think your source made a mistake, ask them. I'm not saying here that you should ask your source to review an article before you publish it, but say you interview the mayor of Ottawa in French, English is his first language, and you think that he made a mistake, ask him just to be sure that the word he used was actually the word he intended to use. And lastly, make sure to use quotes in the right context. If you interview someone about a car crash, don't go and use that quote in a story about a fire. It goes without saying, but you need to make sure that you really use the quote in the right context. And my example might be quite obvious, but say you interview the mayor about taxes, and he says something regarding funding for public transit. Don't go and use that quote in a paragraph pertaining to highways and car traffic, because the quote was about public transit. Using quotes in the right context also means that you should be transparent with your readers as to the source of a quote. If you ask for an interview and your source sends you back some quotes by email, make sure that you write it in your text that the quote is from an email. So-and-so said the following in an email. If you quote someone from a press release, which isn't something that I like to do, but sometimes we have no choice but to, make sure to attribute it to a press release. So here are some ground rules when handling quotes. We should receive enough doses for everyone, Trudeau said, but every single country in the world is also trying to get the vaccine. That's a made-up quote. I'm just using it as an example to talk about the importance of proper punctuation. So in English, a quote should start with quotation marks, and then you have the quote. We should receive enough doses for everyone, comma, inside the quotation marks, close your quotation marks, attribute the quote, so you attribute it to Trudeau here. Trudeau said, period, and then you start a new quote with double quotation marks, but every single country in the world is also trying to get the vaccine, period, inside the quotation marks, close the quotation marks. There are other rules, such as including a quote within a quote. If you want to remove something and put an ellipsis using ... there are rules pertaining to that, so make sure to consult the Canadian Press style book if you aren't sure. Remember that a good story needs to answer important questions: who, what, where, when, why, the 5 W's, and how. And I'm also including 2 more questions: how much and how many. Especially when dealing with data like we will do next fall, it is very important to ask how much, how many. If you cover a protest, ask how many people were there. If you cover a groundbreaking ceremony for a new school, ask about the cost of the project. How much will it cost? So keep these important questions in mind. We've talked about the 5 senses before. Remember that most people can hear, see, touch, smell, taste. So appeal to these senses. Set the tone. But again, be careful not to be cliche. You don't need to force it, but if you do witness an interesting scene, make sure to set the tone in your own article. Generally speaking, it is best to use an active sentence, and we have a few examples here. The economy revived quickly. The ship vanished in the night. A grievance board has ordered the reinstatement of a counselor fired for kicking a patient. Passive sentences can be useful, though. The economy experienced a quick revival. Well, in this case, I would go with the economy revived quickly. The idea is that an active sentence is a sentence in which the subject does an action, whereas a passive sentence is a sentence in which your main subject is subjected to the action. So generally we will use active sentences, action verbs, but know, and that's quite clear in the Canadian Press Style Book, page 289, that there are instances when it is best to use a passive sentence. So we'll just finish reading the examples and I will explain that. The economy experienced a quick revival. At first light, there was no sign of the ship, and a counselor fired for kicking a patient has been ordered reinstated by a grievance board. So all 6 of these sentences are correct, grammatically speaking. I would go, and that's what the Canadian Press Style Book states as well, I would go with the first 2 active sentences. However, if for the third example you wanted to put the emphasis on the fact that the counselor was reinstated, you could go with the passive sentence, the passive voice, so that you would put the emphasis on the fact that the counselor will get his job back. The same goes for, a sentence about someone being arrested. You can say police arrested a man for so-and-so, or a man was arrested for doing this and that. Both work. So just make sure that you use the active or the passive voice based on what it is that you want to say. Narrative points of view are also something that you need to keep in mind. A first-person point of view is when you witness something, or we together witness something, or we live a situation and we use the first person to write about it. So columnists will do that. In magazine writing, it is a popular approach. A second-person point of view is when you use you, like in books of which you are the hero. It is something that you can also use in journalism. Say you were to write an article about COVID-related restrictions. You could use you to grab your reader's attention. 10 things you need to know about the lockdown. And the rest of your story could use the first or third person points of view, but you can use the second person point of view as well. The third person point of view is perhaps the one that we tend to use more regularly in journalism. That's a point of view in which you as the reporter are a third-party observer and you describe the actions of others. So the mayor said, the mayor did, 10,000 people protested. You use the third person, whether it is a singular third person or a plural third person. You describe a situation or a scene as an outside observer. So keep the points of view in mind. Now and then, it might be warranted to use the second person point of view. The first person point of view can also work if you do a human interest story or if you write a column.